already sitting, so I'm not going to say before you sit down. But nonetheless, turn to somebody and say, we're preaching today. I really felt drawn to the Gospel of Jonah. So these words come from that Gospel. So if you will, to turn to somebody and say, the weed, the worm, and the wind. Weed, the worm, and the wind. Or otherwise you could just say, God can use you, you know. Well, so if I'm going to preach a sermon based on the text from Jonah today, some of you might be legitimately disappointed that I had 3 W's and didn't include in that the whale. Right? I suppose that instead we might include the weed, the worm, the wind, and having one more W wouldn't be so bad to say we'll also add the whale. But then again, keep in mind that as Rob just read it for us, the whale, the fish, doesn't show up in the story that we read today. But do keep in mind also that God uses each one of these, the weed, the worm, and the wind, to speak to Jonah, to get his attention. Even though we kind of like the whale story, don't we? In fact, we like it so much we tend to overemphasize it. When we think of the book of Jonah, that's about all we think about. And we forget much of the rest, and that gets a little fishy sometimes. Okay, I was going to say, because if I didn't get some response there, we need a drum section for a rim shot there or something. There it is. But we pick up the story right at the end of the book of Jonah. If you recall, Jonah was called to preach to the Ninevites, those who lived in Nineveh. And as soon as he gets the word that that's what he should be doing, he gets up and goes in exactly the opposite direction. He heads for Tarshish. Now there are some questions about where exactly Tarshish is, or where it was in his day as an ancient city. Some say it is on the Isle of Sardinia, just west of Italy. Others put it all the way out on the western part of the peninsula of Spain, of Iberia. Whatever we can say about Tarshish is that it's much farther away, much harder to get to than it would have been for him to go to Nineveh. If you look at the map that's on the back of your liturgy bulletin this morning, you can kind of see that laid out for you. Jonah gets on a ship in Joppa, just south of Jerusalem. And while he gets on that ship heads out due west. But Nineveh is headed pretty much straight north, a little bit easterly. The trip to Nineveh would have been about 500 miles. Not exactly an easy journey for people in his day. That's a long trip for us too. But certainly a lot shorter than the thousands of miles that it would have been to get to the other side of Italy or Spain. So he doesn't want to go to Nineveh. What is Jonah's beef with Nineveh? Why doesn't he want to go there? He's upset because the people of Nineveh are Assyrians. They have been responsible for destroying the northern kingdom. And they have pressed down hard on the southern kingdom where Jonah is from as well, hitting them with taxes and with atrocities. The Ninevites and the Assyrians, they have been the force of evil in their day, bringing havoc to all the areas around Israel, and Jonah certainly would have been aware. The Ninevites and the Assyrians are actually proud to display their violence, their brutal conquest of other peoples and other cities, including the Israeli city of Lachish. They actually even established a museum to show what they did to those people, and the pictures, they're not pretty. So Jonah doesn't want to go. He doesn't want to share a message of salvation with those people. He is concerned that God will actually show them mercy. And he, Jonah, wants to see their destruction. The modern day equivalent that I could think of that would give us some kind of idea of why Jonah was so reluctant to go, it would be like us hearing about somebody who says they've been called to preach peace and love to ISIS, after they display the beheading of journalists and others. That's how bad it is for Jonah to go to Nineveh. And so when Jonah picks up and goes towards Tarshish instead, God sends the whale. The whale to pick up Jonah. The whale that not only picks up Jonah in the middle of the storm, but takes him in another direction and then spits him out in the right direction, moves him on up north towards Nineveh. Jonah goes, but he goes reluctantly, resentfully, bitterly, ungraciously. He goes and he shares the message. Oh, and don't get me wrong, he doesn't sugarcoat it. He minimizes it. He figures the least that I say to these people, the less chance there is of them actually responding to the word. And so his whole message is this: 40 days more, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. That's all he said to them. Didn't even sound convincing. And certainly there was no mention of God's mercy in Jonah's message. But somehow, even in that message, the Ninevites heard God speaking to them, and it says that they changed their ways. You can go back and read the rest of chapter 3. I promise you it's not very long. In fact, the whole book is a read that you can do in about 5 minutes. And in chapter 3, they go into extensive description of what the Ninevites did when they heard Jonah's message, about how they repented from their actions, how they put themselves in sackcloth and ashes and fasting and everything that they could do so that they could come into a better relationship with God. Jonah's message is so simple, so minimalistic, that it seems to me that the only way his message could have had an impact is because God must have already been at work in the lives of the people who get to hear that message. They just needed someone to speak this specific word from God to direct them in the way they need to go. A word spoken at just the right time sometimes makes all the difference. In Proverbs 25 it says that a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in a setting of silver. So the word that he spoke must have been the right words. And so he's done that, and all that has taken place, and that's where we picked up the reading this morning. After all that has already happened, today's word deals with Jonah and the aftermath. So in the movie version of all of this, okay, I don't know if there is a movie version, so you'll have to make it up in your mind as I try to describe it. You know, the main action is over, and it's like the after events right now. He's sitting on a hill outside of town, place where he can overlook the whole city, and he's waiting. He is waiting for destruction, right? 40 days and all of this will be destroyed. That was his message, right? So he's waiting for destruction, but there's nothing happening from the heavens that he expects. And oh boy, is Jonah mad. He is upset. He's bitter. He's disgusted even with God. I know it, God, he said. That's why I didn't want to go in the first place. I didn't want to see this happening, this nothing happening to the people of Nineveh. But you see, Jonah has to learn something about God's mercy. He knows all about it up here in his head because he responds to God. He says, "For I know you are a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in kindness, renouncing punishment." But what he knows in his head is not present in his heart. In his heart, he is upset. In fact, he says, "I would rather die than live to see these Assyrians from Nineveh receive God's mercy." Jonah's reluctance to preach matches what's happening in the larger culture of Israel. It's the same feeling that others are feeling, and you can understand when you put it into modern day terms how we would feel if the same thing were happening. They are ready to go to war. None of this mercy stuff. That's for wimps. So before the closing credits on this movie roll, God decides to teach the reluctant prophet something about divine mercy and compassion. Jonah is sitting out there in the heat of the day. Okay, you don't have to imagine this, just any day in Florida will do, right? And so he builds himself a little lean-to, something to shelter him a little bit. God says, "Oh, I'm going to help you out." And so he gives him a weed, a little bush to grow, something to grow over him as he's sitting there having his pouting party, his little sulking opportunity. A little bush to grow over him and give him a little shade. Huh? We've got senna trees in the backyard that are not only growing, they're there because we're supposed to have some kind of caterpillar on them. We seem to keep having butterflies lay eggs, but no caterpillars growing on them. But the trees are growing. They're taking over the whole garden. They're like a weed that way. You know, plants grow slowly. Weeds grow quickly. And in one day, Jonah has all the shade that he wants. And yeah, he's kind of grateful. But the next day, God sends the worm. And you know what happens, right? They eat through the stem right at the bottom, and the whole thing just starts to wilt and break down and fall over, and no more shade. Now he's sitting there in the hot, blazing sun again. And not only that, then comes the wind. Not a nice, cool breeze. We like to go down by the lake in our backyard. And by the way, it's come up a couple of inches and a couple of inches over these days. We like to go down there because there's always a good chance that you might catch a little bit of a cool breeze down there. But this was no cool breeze. This is a hot wind blowing sand into his face and covering his body. It's not something that's pleasant. It's making him even more miserable. And that's when God speaks to Jonah about his own sense of self. He says, "Are you so grieved about the plant?" And he says, "Yes, so deeply that I want to die." And the Lord says, "You cared about the plant. You didn't work for it. You didn't grow it. It appeared overnight and it perished overnight. But you care about it. And should I not care about Nineveh, a city of 120,000 people? People, it says, who don't know their left hand from their right." Now that's pretty confused. I don't know how they were such a great force if they didn't know their left hand from their right. But there's something else going on here, and God is trying to show it to them. He says, not only that, but animals, beasts as well. And you know what? Just in case you didn't get the point where we ended today, where God asks that question, that's where the chapter ends. That's where the reading ends. But guess what? That's actually where the book ends. It leaves us to answer the question. We don't know how it turns out from there, because the whole story comes to a conclusion right there. So we are actually left to draw our own conclusions for ourselves. What does it mean for Jonah? What does it mean for us? Apart from the obvious, you remember how the Supremes put it, ain't no mountain high enough, ain't no valley low enough, ain't no river deep enough or fish big enough to keep God from you and me. Oh, okay, it took some license. God can speak to us through the smallest of things. Through a weed, a worm, the wind, the whale. Okay, maybe not small things only. But God can speak to us through these things, and God can also use us. Whether or not we are happy about it, whether or not our heart is in it, no big grand message that we have to prepare, just a few simple words or an action that we take at the exact moment as God directs us. I don't know if I have a favorite TV show anymore. Actually, Nancy and I just made the decision to cut the cable, or in our case, cut the satellite cable, because we felt like we were paying too much for too little value every month. So I don't know about TV programs. We're going to still have some access to TV. But I can tell you about my two favorite radio programs. All right, so how retro is that, right? I heard White Old Records were coming back too, by the way. Both of the programs that I enjoy are both on NPR. They're both on Saturday. One is called The Moth. If any of you ever heard of it, I think it's at 4 o'clock. The other one is TED Talks. Have any of you heard TED Talks before? TED stands for Technology, Entertainment, Design. And the people who give these TED Talks have some incredible insights and understandings. And it's always around a particular theme. And yesterday the theme was transformation. They had 4 riveting stories. And I encourage you to listen to them or read them. You can go to ted.npr.org and you can download the stories. You can download the podcast, however it is that you want to do it. The 4th story struck me particularly. It was a story about a young man who was in jail for murder. In the story, he shared his upbringing. He shared what had happened to him in early life. He shared how he had been an honor roll student with plans to become a doctor. And he talked about life experiences and how at 19 he ended up on what he called the other side of the trigger. Somewhere between being arrested and ending up in solitary confinement where he spent 7.5 years, he began to think about transformation in his life. He began to think about redemption. Even though he says he was not then and is not today a religious person, nor did he think of it as a religious moment, nonetheless, he got a letter one day from his son. It was a short letter. It was a turning point. There were simple words, but they were profound. The letter said, "Mama told me you were in prison for murder. Dad, don't kill. Jesus watches what you do." What he realized in the letter was not so much about how Jesus cared for him and loved for him. It was that his own son viewed him as a murderer. And that was the moment that changed his life. From what was already beginning to happen in him, he needed those few words to be said to move him and motivate him into a whole new way of life. He began his own program of study in the jail cell. He said he turned his jail cell into a little classroom. And he went into a program of transformation and of learning and of studying. And I mean, he's talking about reading Socrates and Homer and all kinds. I mean, he's reading all kinds of stuff to get himself to a new point. And now he's out of jail. Now he's running a mentoring program for young people in the city of Detroit. And he says that he recognizes that the majority of people, including the majority of those who are incarcerated, are redeemable. Anyone, he says, can have a transformation if we create the space for that to happen. I hope that is what we continue to be about transformation. As we continue as a congregation and as individuals to listen for God's voice, just like Jonah heard it, maybe in the small things. I don't know what lesson there is in not putting your pot in the coffee machine before you run it. But you know, there are things that happen to all of us during the day, and if we stop and say, what am I supposed to learn from this? You know, maybe we'll get something. It might be annoying. It might be scary. It might be overwhelming. It might be beautiful. But as we continue to listen for God's voice in our study of Scripture, by listening to our community, by listening to our faith community, as we listen in our own congregation, it's not just about listening as an exercise, though that has a lot to commend for itself as well. It's about listening to hear God's voice and to figure out just how the weed, and the worm, and the wind, and the whale, and whatever else God chooses to speak to us through, how those things are directing us in a path that God can use for good. May we be open to hearing God's voice and respond. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.